President Trump took a jab at a royal guard on live international television. "Where did you learn English?" he asked with a smug grin, thinking it was just a harmless joke. But in a room filled with diplomats, military personnel, and cameras, broadcasting to millions, that single remark shifted the tone completely. The royal guard didn't react with anger or pride. He didn't even blink. He responded with one calm, composed sentence, and it changed everything. By the time he finished, the entire nation was left in shock. Before we reveal exactly what happened, be sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because this wasn't just a reply. It was a moment that America will remember. The Dorchester Hotel ballroom in London hummed with the kind of tension that only comes when world leaders gather in one room. Crystal chandeliers cast their golden glow over assembled diplomats, ministers, and military officials from both sides of the Atlantic. The annual Anglo-American Defense Summit had always been a formal affair, but tonight felt different. The air crackled with unspoken political undercurrents. Major Elliot Graham stood at parade rest near the British delegation, his posture reflecting decades of military discipline. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had seen combat in 3 different theaters. His dress uniform was immaculate, each medal telling a story of service that few in that gilded room could comprehend. The Afghanistan Campaign Medal caught the light beside his military cross, earned in circumstances that still woke him some nights. Graham's eyes swept the room with practiced efficiency, cataloguing exits, scanning faces, noting the subtle security details that most would miss. This was his nature, always alert, always prepared. He had been handpicked for this assignment, not just for his military record, but for his ability to navigate the delicate world of international diplomacy without losing the steel that made him an effective soldier. As Trump approached the podium, Graham observed the American president's characteristic swagger, the way he commanded attention even before speaking. The crowd gradually quieted, champagne glasses stilling as conversations died away. Graham had studied Trump's file. Of course, every public appearance, every diplomatic incident, every pattern of behavior that might be relevant to tonight's security concerns. Trump leaned into the microphone, his presence filling the room. There was something predatory in his smile as his gaze swept across the assembled officials and finally settled on Graham. The major felt that familiar tingle of awareness that had kept him alive in Helmand Province, the sense that trouble was about to begin. "And this guy," Trump began, his voice carrying that familiar mix of showmanship and mockery. "Great outfit, really terrific, but tell me, Major, where'd you learn English? Some fancy London school?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired rifle. Nervous laughter rippled through parts of the crowd, but Graham noticed how many faces remained stone still. The German Chancellor shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A U.S. general at the head table grimaced visibly. Even some of Trump's own staff looked away. Graham's expression remained carved from granite. He had faced down Taliban fighters in mountain passes and stared into the eyes of men who wanted him dead. A man in an expensive suit making jokes about his accent hardly registered as a threat, but something deeper stirred memories of other times, other places, when his voice had been mocked, questioned, dismissed. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable for everyone except Graham. He had learned long ago that silence could be a weapon more powerful than words. In the Hindu Kush mountains, silence had meant the difference between life and death. Here, in this glittering ballroom, it served a different purpose. It forced people to truly listen to what had just been said. Trump's smile began to fade slightly as the quiet extended beyond the normal bounds of polite response. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. Usually, his verbal jabs produced immediate responses: laughter, anger, embarrassment. Graham gave him nothing. "Cat, got your tongue?" Trump pressed, his tone growing sharper. "Or is that not allowed? In the Queen's Army?" More uncomfortable shifting in the audience. The British ambassador to the United States closed his eyes briefly, as if summoning patience. Several journalists in the back straightened, sensing that this exchange might become the story of the evening. Graham's fingers twitched, once against his thigh, a only outward sign of the storm building beneath his calm exterior. That tiny movement was noticed by exactly 3 people in the room: his commanding officer, who knew Graham's tells from years of service together, a British intelligence operative who made it his business to read body language, and Trump himself, who had spent a lifetime learning to spot weakness in others. But if Trump thought he had found weakness, he was about to learn otherwise. The moderator, a nervous deputy secretary from the Foreign Office, cleared his throat softly. Perhaps, Major Graham would like to respond. Graham turned his head slightly toward the moderator, then back to Trump. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 1,000 dawn patrols, the authority of a man who had given orders under fire and been obeyed without question. "My English, sir," Graham began, each word measured and precise. "I learned it helping my mother appeal NHS cuts that nearly killed her when I was 8 years old. I perfected it briefing SAS teams before operations in Helmand Province. I polished it writing condolence letters to 23 widows last year alone." The room had gone deathly still. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. Silver trays suspended mid. Trump's confident smirk had vanished entirely, replaced by something harder to read. Graham continued, his voice never rising, never betraying emotion, but somehow carrying more weight with each word. "But if you mean my accent, Mr. President, that comes from standing on a guard while American soldiers laid wreaths for their dead beside mine. Tradition isn't about words, sir. It's about knowing when to stop talking." The aftermath was immediate and electric. Several people in the audience drew sharp breaths. The British Prime Minister's press secretary was already reaching for her phone, recognizing that this moment would define the evening's news cycle. At the American table, staffers exchanged glances that ranged from admiration to horror. Trump stood frozen at the podium for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 seconds. His face cycled through several expressions: surprise, calculation, and something that might have been respect, though it was gone too quickly to be certain. The applause began slowly, starting with a single pair of hands from someone in the British delegation. Then it spread, growing stronger, more sustained. It wasn't the polite golf clap of diplomatic functions. This was genuine appreciation for a masterful display of grace under pressure. Graham remained at attention throughout the applause, his expression unchanged. He had not spoken for effect or for praise. He had simply told the truth, and if that truth happened to silence a bully, so be it. As the formal proceedings resumed, the real story was already beginning to unfold in the digital realm. Phones had captured video snippets. Twitter feeds were lighting up. #RoyalBun began trending within minutes, followed quickly by #Major Graham and #know when to stop talking. The British press officer who had been dreading this evening's potential diplomatic disasters found herself managing something entirely different: a public relations victory that money couldn't buy. Her American counterpart faced the opposite challenge. Within an hour, major news networks were already preparing segments. CNN's Kyron would read British officers' measured response to Trump's mockery. Fox News, ever loyal, tried diplomatic tensions rise at London summit, but even their most Trump-friendly anchors struggled to spin Graham's response as anything other than dignified and devastating. The story that began to emerge was far richer than the simple exchange suggested. Reporters started digging into Graham's background, and what they found painted a picture of a man whose life had been defined by service, sacrifice, and an unshakable sense of duty. Elliot Graham's story began in the Warbles, one of Glasgow's most challenging neighborhoods, where his mother Amina had settled after fleeing civil war in Somalia. She arrived with a 6-year-old son, minimal English, and determination that burned like a forge fire. The NHS cuts Trump had unknowingly referenced weren't abstract policy to the Graham family, they were a matter of life and death. Young Elliot had spent his childhood serving as translator, advocate, and sometimes the only voice his mother had in navigating British bureaucracy. While other children played football in the streets, he sat in government offices, carefully passing official letters and medical documents, learning that words had power and that precision mattered. His mother's illness, a heart condition that went undiagnosed for months due to communication barriers, had nearly killed her when Elliot was 8. It was during those terrifying weeks in hospital waiting rooms that he truly mastered English, driven by the knowledge that his mother's life might depend on his ability to make doctors and administrators understand her needs. The experience left him with 2 unshakable beliefs: that service to others was the highest calling, and that clear communication could literally save lives. These principles would guide him through grammar school, where he excelled despite the poverty and occasional prejudice that marked his childhood. His teachers recognized his potential early. Mrs. Henderson, his English instructor, stayed after school to help him with university applications. Mr. MacLeod, the history teacher who had served in the Falklands, saw something familiar in the young man's bearing and recommended him for the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. The scholarship that took Graham to Cambridge for linguistic studies before his military service was hard-won. He studied Arabic, Pashto, and Dari with the same intensity he had once applied to translating his mother's medical bills. Languages weren't academic exercises for him, they were tools for building bridges, for understanding people whose lives had been shaped by circumstances as difficult as his own. At Sandhurst, Graham found his calling. The military's emphasis on honor, duty, and service resonated with values his mother had instilled through her own example. She had never asked for pity or special treatment, only for the chance to build a better life for her son. Graham approached his military career with the same dignity. Graham's first deployment to Afghanistan came in 2008, during some of the heaviest fighting the British forces had seen in Helmand Province. As a newly commissioned lieutenant with language skills, he was assigned to Joint Task Force operations, working alongside American Special Forces and Afghan interpreters to coordinate complex missions. It was there that Graham's childhood experience of being caught between languages and cultures proved invaluable. He understood the isolation of being the translator, the one who carried responsibility for making sure nothing was lost in communication. He treated the Afghan interpreters with respect that was often absent in military hierarchies, and they responded with loyalty that saved British and American lives on more than one occasion. The operation that earned Graham his military cross was typical of his approach to leadership: careful planning, absolute commitment to his men's safety, and the courage to act when circumstances demanded it. His unit had been pinned down by Taliban fighters in a compound outside Musakala. The radio chatter was confused, coordinates were unclear, and air support was being directed to the wrong location. Graham made the decision to leave cover and establish direct communication with the helicopter crews, using his language skills to coordinate with Afghan forces and his tactical training to mark targets for the incoming strikes. He spent 40 minutes under fire, calling in support that ultimately saved his entire unit, but it was what happened after the fighting that his men remembered most. Graham insisted on personally visiting every wounded soldier in the field hospital, speaking to each in their own language when possible, ensuring that their families were contacted and that their sacrifices were properly documented. The letters he mentioned to Trump weren't a metaphor. Graham had made it his personal mission to write to the family of every soldier under his command who had been killed or seriously wounded. He visited their homes when he returned to Britain, attended funerals, and maintained relationships with widows and parents long after official obligations ended. By the time of his promotion to major, Graham had written over 100 such letters. Each one was crafted with the same precision he brought to tactical planning, because he understood that these words would be read and reread by grieving families, that they might be the last official communication about their loved one's service. The widows Trump had unknowingly referenced included Sarah Mitchell, whose husband James had died in an IED explosion during Graham's second tour. Graham had been the one to identify the body, to gather James's personal effects, and to ensure that his final letters home reached Sarah before the official notification. When Graham returned to Britain, he kept his promise to visit Sarah and her 2 young children. What was supposed to be a brief official call became a regular friendship. Graham helped with school applications, fixed broken appliances, and served as a steady presence during the children's most difficult years. Sarah Mitchell would later tell reporters that Graham never spoke about his own service or his own losses. He focused entirely on keeping James's memory alive for the children, sharing stories of their father's courage and humor that wouldn't have appeared in any official record. This pattern repeated across Britain, in quiet suburbs and council estates, in farmhouses and city flats. Families affected by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan knew Major Elliot Graham, not as a decorated officer, but as the man who remembered their loved ones, who showed up when it mattered, who proved that military honor meant more than ceremonies and medals. The Oxford shoes Graham was polishing in his quarters at Wellington Barracks after the Trump incident had walked through dozens of such homes. They had stood beside gravesites in military cemeteries and in parish churchyards. They had worn paths, 2 front doors where his arrival brought both sorrow and comfort: sorrow for the loss that necessitated his visit, comfort in knowing that someone of rank and authority cared enough to come personally. His fellow officers respected Graham's dedication, but few understood the personal cost. The letters he wrote often took hours to compose, as he struggled to find words that honored the dead without romanticizing war, that offered comfort without false promises, that acknowledged grief without encouraging despair. Graham's small apartment near the barracks was spartanly furnished except for one wall, careful arrangement of photographs sent by families over the years, birthday parties, graduations, weddings, new babies. These were the lives that continued, because of sacrifices made in distant mountains and desert compounds. When young officers asked for his advice about writing condolence letters, Graham always gave the same counsel. Tell them something specific about their son or daughter that you remember. Tell them how their child's service mattered to you personally, and tell them the truth about how much it hurts to lose someone under your command. The Trump incident at the Dorchester had caught Graham completely off guard, not because he was unfamiliar with prejudice or mockery, but because he had assumed that diplomatic protocols would prevent such overt displays of disrespect. His response had been instinctive, drawing on decades of experience in turning potential confrontations into teachable moments. Back at Wellington Barracks, Graham's phone had been buzzing constantly since the encounter. Messages from former soldiers, family, members of the fallen, fellow officers, and even strangers who had seen the video clips online. Most expressed pride in his response, but Graham found the attention uncomfortable. Lieutenant Davies, fresh from Sandhurst and full of admiration for his commanding officer, knocked on Graham's door around midnight. "Sir, the PM's office called. They want to recommend you for additional honors. The press is calling you a hero." Graham looked up from the letter he was writing condolences to the family of a soldier who had died by suicide 3 weeks after returning from deployment, a casualty of war that wouldn't appear in any official statistics. "Davies," Graham said, quietly, "heroes are the ones who don't come home." "I'm just doing my job," the young lieutenant persisted. "But sir, what you said to the president, everyone's talking about it. Social media is going mad. They're saying you taught him about dignity and service." Graham set down his pen and studied the younger man's eager face. He recognized something of his own youthful idealism in Davies's expression, the belief that single moments could change the world, that the right words delivered at the right time could shift the course of history. "Davies, sit down," Graham said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Let me tell you something about dignity. It's not something you display for cameras or audiences. It's what you do when no one is watching, when there's no recognition, when the only witness is your own conscience." He gestured toward the wall of photographs. "Every face there represents a choice, not just the choice their loved one made to serve, but choices I made about how to honor that service. Writing letters isn't heroic. Visiting families isn't extraordinary. It's simply what you do when you understand that leadership means accepting responsibility for the lives entrusted to your care." Graham returned to his letter, his handwriting careful and deliberate. "The president made a joke tonight," I responded honestly. "Tomorrow, Mrs. Patterson will receive this letter about her son's service and sacrifice. Which do you think matters more?" Meanwhile, aboard Air Force One, Trump's evening was unfolding very differently. The president had left the Dorchester earlier than planned, his staff citing schedule changes but privately acknowledging that remaining would have only deepened the embarrassment of the evening's exchange. Senior advisor Stephen Miller sat across from Trump, scrolling through social media responses on his tablet. The hashtags were brutal, the memes merciless, and even conservative commentators were struggling to defend Trump's behavior. "It's not playing well, Sir Miller said carefully. "Graham's military record is ... impressive. Cambridge education, multiple deployments, decorated for valor. The optics are challenging." Trump stared out the aircraft window at the lights of London receding below. His usual bluster seemed deflated, replaced by something closer to genuine frustration. "Get me his file," he said finally. "The full military record." When the dossier arrived 20 minutes later, Trump read it in silence. The details painted a picture that even his most loyal supporters would find difficult to attack. A refugee's son who had risen through merit and service, who had risked his life for Western values, who had earned respect through actions rather than inheritance. The Bronze Star citation was particularly damaging to any attempt at criticism for exceptionally meritorious service in a combat zone, displaying extraordinary courage under enemy fire. while coordinating joint operations that saved the lives of coalition forces and Afghan civilians. Trump's communications director was already fielding calls from reporters seeking comment on the evening's events. The questions were pointed and difficult. How did the president respond to being corrected about service and sacrifice by a decorated war veteran? Did he plan to apologize for mocking a soldier's accent? What message did this send to America's allies about respect for their military personnel? The standard Trump playbook: double down, attack the critic, question their motives, seemed inadequate. Against an opponent whose record was unassailable and whose response had been so measured that any aggressive counterattack would only make the president appear more petty and vindictive. For perhaps the first time in his political career, Trump faced a situation where his usual tactics would only make things worse. Graham had won the exchange not through clever rhetoric or political maneuvering, but through simple dignity and truth. Back in London, the media response was swift and overwhelmingly favorable to Graham. The BBC led with British officers' dignified response to presidential mockery, while the Times headline read "The quiet authority of true leadership." Even traditionally Trump-friendly outlets like the Daily Mail struggled to defend the president's behavior. The story that emerged in the following days revealed the full scope of Graham's remarkable journey. Journalists interviewed his former teachers in Glasgow, his commanding officers from Afghanistan, and the families he had supported through their darkest hours. Each interview added depth to the portrait of a man whose life had been defined by service, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right, regardless of personal cost. Mrs. Henderson, Graham's former English teacher, was particularly eloquent when contacted by reporters. Elliot was always special, not because he was smarter than other children, but because he understood even as a boy that education was a responsibility, not just an opportunity. He learned English not for himself, but so he could help his mother and others who needed a voice. The revelation of Graham's linguistic abilities added another dimension to the story. His fluency in Arabic, Pashto, and Dari wasn't academic achievement, it represented years of study, motivated by a desire to understand and serve people whose lives had been torn apart by conflicts he was trained to help resolve. Colonel Sarah Thompson, Graham's former commanding officer in Afghanistan, provided context that made Trump's mockery seem even more tone-deaf. Major Graham saved American lives, she told CNN. His ability to communicate with local populations, to understand cultural nuances, to bridge language barriers, these skills were literally the difference between successful missions and catastrophic failures. The interviews revealed a pattern that defined Graham's entire career: excellence achieved not for personal glory, but in service to others. His Cambridge degree, his military decorations, his diplomatic assignments each represented not ambition, but duty. Perhaps most tellingly, every person interviewed mentioned the same quality: Graham's ability to listen. In a world of loud voices and grand gestures, he had built his reputation on the quieter virtues of attention, empathy, and careful response. As the week following the Dorchester incident unfolded, the contrast between Trump's public persona and Graham's quiet authority became a subject of international commentary. Editorial writers and political analysts found in Graham's response a masterclass in how to handle bullying not through escalation or retaliation, but through dignified truth-telling that exposed the emptiness of the attack. The letters Graham had mentioned continued to arrive at homes across Britain and America. Mrs. Patterson received her letter about her son's service, written in Graham's careful handwriting, describing specific memories of a young soldier's courage and kindness. Sarah Mitchell's children received birthday cards that their father's commanding officer had remembered to send. 5 years after James's death, these quiet acts of remembrance and service continued, unremarked by media but noticed by the people who mattered most, the families who had sacrificed everything for their countries. Security. Graham himself remained largely silent about the incident, declining most interview requests and returning to his regular duties. When pressed by journalists, he offered only brief comments that redirected attention away from himself and toward the broader questions of service and sacrifice that he believed were more important than any individual exchange of words. The real story, he told one persistent reporter, isn't what happened at the Dorchester. It's what happens every day when ordinary people choose to serve something larger than themselves. That's the tradition I represent, and it's a tradition that belongs to no single nation or individual. The incident had lasted less than 5 minutes, but its reverberations continued long after the diplomatic summit ended. In military academies and officer training programs, Graham's response became a case study in leadership under pressure. In schools and universities, it sparked discussions about dignity, respect, and the power of measured response. Most importantly, in the quiet homes where military families grieved their losses and celebrated their service, Major Elliot Graham's example reminded them that their sacrifices had not been forgotten, that somewhere in the corridors of power, there were still people who understood the true meaning of honor. Trump returned to America to face questions about respect for allies and understanding of military service. Graham returned to his small apartment, to his stack of letters waiting to be written, to his wall of photographs that reminded him daily why his service mattered. The contrast between these two responses, one seeking attention and validation, the other seeking only to fulfill duty, captured something essential about leadership in the modern world. In an era of endless noise and manufactured outrage, Graham's quiet authority stood as a reminder that the most powerful responses are often the most measured ones. The man who had learned English to save his mother's life had used those same language skills to deliver a lesson in dignity that would be remembered long after the news cycle moved on to other stories. In a world that often confused volume with strength, Elliot Graham had proven that sometimes the most devastating response is simply telling the truth.